Today we're talking about building resilient communities, particularly here with a group that have been organizing efforts to deal with COVID-19 over the last 6 months. And as we, cross the threshold of September, kind of a chance to look back and say, what did we learn from this? What can we carry forward, regardless of whether PPE is the immediate need? What are the things that makerspaces and makers community is learning from this, and others more broadly in creating a rapid response to a crisis? So I'm interested in learning from these folks today what they're thinking and their different approaches to this. So I'm Dale Doherty, as I said, and we this time have we'll put it up in the doc. We'll have a Google Docs set up if you have notes or anything you want to add. I'm kind of looking for ideas that come from the panelists that we might put on online afterwards as something to also to share. I'm joined today by Dorothy Jones-Davis, co-host, and she's executive director of Nation of Makers. Also, our panel today is Robert Reed. He founded Public Invention. Robert, we talked to earlier when he was doing the wonderful list of open source ventilators projects and kind of ranking and rating them, and continues to be interested in what's the future of how the role of open source in medical devices. So really glad to have him. We have two folks from Artisans Asylum, Karen Cornish and Sarah Miller. Both have been working on the gowns production. Karen is telling me she's from Vermont and grows plants of natural dye, which is a great maker subject that we could tackle some other time in the future. But she was called into helping organize the efforts around gown production. And Sarah was really a designer that put a lot of these, you really figured it out in the beginning. And we've had a conversation with Sarah in the past on how to put this together. Nathan Parker, welcome. Nathan has been involved with OSMS and helpful engineering as well. He's also been involved with Field Ready and some other organizations that dealt with disaster relief. So we'll be talking to him about what he's learned. And finally, V. Ha, who's from the Makerspace at Los Angeles Public Library, and has been doing things on the community level to reach out. So let me start with Guy, if you don't mind. Guy, a few weeks ago or maybe a week ago, you kind of stopped doing the tally. You said that was going to be the final tally, which sort of signals a transition for your organization. And I'd kind of just invite you to talk a little bit about where you think things are for OSMS and kind of the state of the world from your point of view.
Yeah, so open source medical supplies, we regularly every Friday collected a tally of what folks had made over the past week. And that tally ranged from a couple 100,000 units of medical supplies to about 1.4 million units per week at our peak of open source production around the globe. And we had been noticing, like with each tally, that number of people responding dropped off, number of units that people had made had dropped off. And it was actually, it was for a couple of reasons. One was, the people who were volunteering and the people who were still donating were tending to run out of steam, run out of materials, run out of donated funds, right? And like slowly closing up shop and going back to their day jobs. And then there was a smaller group that was formalizing and becoming businesses, right? Like new small businesses, or they were just selling, and then all of a sudden it's not a fun community activity that you're just doing, to be part of the team. It's like, this is my 9 to 5, and I'm a lot less excited about talking about this on Facebook because I'm just out producing things. So the interesting thing that happened in the final tally is a lot of the people who were saying, hey, we made this into our day job, we're showing up to say, like, we haven't been submitting, but just letting you know, like, we're still making stuff and we're still excited and we're still hoping. And a lot of the other folks who were volunteering are saying, hey, we're ready to help if it's needed, but right this second, it doesn't seem like it, right? Either suppliers are catching up, or there's not as much need directly. So yeah, it was a bit of a watershed moment. And for us as OSMS, we started looking into like, well, what can we do to kind of like help formalize across a whole bunch of different levels, like what we've already learned. How do we get these kinds of lessons to be a little more permanent? Um, so that's our role right now, is we're very, very actively trying to figure out what comes next for us as an organization and what we think the best role of formalization is. And that's something I'm happy to talk about, but I don't want to take up all the time.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's good. I'll come back to you. Let me introduce Robert Reed, and Robert, as I said, for many of us that were paying any attention, ventilators were the kind of the first need, and a lot of people, including Guy and others, set out to solve that problem. And Robert started to organize that, but it's changed a lot in the 6 to 9 months. There's probably not the same need, but the process that I think underwent there is we are in need of that kind of innovation process. So welcome, Robert.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree. And I think you've articulated it. I mean, I think the catastrophe of COVID-19 has a bit of a silver lining. And in a way, these organizations, including OSMS and Helpful Engineering, have created something new. And Dale, you've called it Plan C. I might call it humanitarian making. I think what a lot of the organizations have learned to do is how to stand up an organization, involve makers, and have what I might call a bigger tent than for example, the average article in Make magazine addresses, in the sense that making for humanitarian purposes requires deployment, finance, logistics. It requires people who might not think of themselves as makers coming together in a team. And I can think many of the ventilator teams, but also OSMS, Helpful Engineering, and Public Invention have learned how to put together a team quickly, which is something that I think the making community and certainly the free software community sort of knew how to do, but they didn't know how to combine that with logistics and sometimes legal issues and sometimes regulatory issues and make the space bigger. And so, as you've said, for a number of reasons, including amongst the ventilator teams, at one time there were 100 ventilator teams operating. Now I think they're closer to 25. Some of the steam has gone out of that need, but nonetheless, all of those people have learned how to stand up a team and perform that function a little bit better. So in a way, I think we've gotten bigger. And one of the things that I've personally learned is, if you can find someone who can provide a little bit of leadership, and it just really requires articulating the need and connecting the people, you can find people to do the work to fulfill the need. But you have to have someone willing to say, I see a need over there, and put a little bit of time into organizing people to fulfill the need. So I think if we think about the whole community, in a way, I see the free software community, because ventilators and sophisticated medical devices always require software. Maybe gowns don't, but they still have to be designed, combining with the making community to sort of create maybe a new thing. And maybe it's always been there, but we just weren't willing to give it a name before now. And we could call it Plan C or humanitarian making, or it may go in a number of different directions next.
Well, and I mean, I think I'd like to say that it always was, I really am a firm believer that it always was there. Like, what happened was we had, a catalyst, right? So we had an initiating, event that happened that made everybody sort of say, okay, well, you know, I can't stand by and watch, right? Like I have to do something. What's that something? And I think you spoke very well, Robert, to the idea that, you know, there are all these different people with all these different skill sets. And I think, you know, even myself, you know, wearing the Nation of Makers cap, you know, when we talk about, and Dale for years has talked about, you know, everybody's a maker, right? And what does that mean? And what are we talking about when we're talking about making? And I think that broadening of what we're thinking about when we think about making, that it's not just one thing, it's a series of things. And sometimes it's done together, right? Sometimes it's done very far away, socially distant, but together, right? So I think that's kind of what we saw. And I mean, I don't want to mess up the order of the conversation here, but I was thinking, you know, Nathan, I know you've done a lot of work with Field Ready and some of the organizations that have been doing this kind of humanitarian making for years, you know, in other sort of disaster crisis scenarios. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think there's a lot to be learned from those communities, and maybe we haven't seen it to the scale that we're seeing it now. So now that we had a vision of like what this could be scaled to, I wonder what lessons now we could go back and still learn. You know, are there other lessons to be learned from the work that that has, you know, already been laid down from these organizations like Field Ready, Communitaire, Burners Without Borders? The list goes on and on for other organizations that have been doing humanitarian making, even Robert's organization, Public Invention, over the years.
Yeah, I mean, so it's an excellent segue. I'll try to keep my response somewhat contained. So a lot of what we've seen that's been, you know, known in the intersection of sort of maker tech and disaster response for a long time is that the first thing to fall away in a catastrophe is the supply chain. And for most of us in the developed West, this is something that is just so pervasive and invisible that we lean on it without realizing it until it's gone. In much of the world, it only kind of exists, or it's extractive and doesn't deliver anything. So this is why things like maker tech, you know, where you can make the thing that you need where and when you need it, is so important. You know, a lot of what I've seen and a lot of what I've spent a lot of time, you know, yelling at everybody who will listen since March about is that, you know, the solutions for 90-something% of the problems that we've been trying to deal with exist. The problem is that it is literally easier for people to, you know, have a hackathon and invent a new thing and try to prototype it than it is to find the things that already exist, instantiate them, iterate on them, improve on them. There's no convergence of design. It's always diverging. You know, the number of wheels being reinvented is mind-boggling. And so a lot of what I've been working on is trying to work from a systems perspective and say, how can makerspaces be a part of a supply chain mesh network, a decentralized supply chain that can instantiate itself when and where it's needed with like self-healing network topology, like a Tor network, if anyone's familiar with that. And, you know, this requires discoverability. This requires a lot of things that are very well solved problems in open source software, and no one has really bothered to solve them at scale in hardware yet. So this is why I ended up working on things like the Open Know-How project, which is the first universal open hardware data standard. This is with like OSHWA and Field Ready and Wikifactory and a whole bunch of us coming got together to do this. The next piece is Open Nowhere, which is capability mapping. Like a universal open data standard where any space can say, these are all of the tools that we have, this is the throughput, the materials they can take, et cetera. And with those two data sets, and then any third, like, you know, the Johns Hopkins medical data, you can start doing things like saying, okay, this place just had a major event. We're going to expect a spike of cases in 2 weeks. We're going to start automatically routing, you know, medical supplies that can be made by the spaces in that area to them right now, so they can be up to speed then. Like this level of automation is, we absolutely are going to need to be ready for whatever's coming. You know, the level of difficulty that we've been dealing with in the last 6 months, these are the good old days. It only goes up from here. So if we're going to learn anything, it is how to coordinate more effectively.
Okay, good. Yeah, Sarah, let's go to you if we can. Sarah and Karen are both with Artisans Asylum. And Sarah, let's talk a little bit of just how the Gowns project, you know, got off the ground there. And then, you know, kind of what you learned by scaling that with Karen.
I say one of the most interesting things to note based on the conversation so far and in regards to our Gowns project was how the masks were dropped in terms of, and walls were dropped between for instance, us in hospitals. And so these large organizations that we used to have like no contact with, I feel like startups and emergency services were familiar with, oh my God, we've all got to work together. But a lot of these large organizations, they never needed anybody nearby. They don't need us in any way. And all of a sudden, the need was tremendous. And it was on a very personal level because everybody could get infected. Every single one of us could get infected. And so this breakdown of walls and everybody seeing each other in each other's houses allowed for these amazing open forums to allow for this amazing kind of coordination and kind of cross-contamination or cross-pollination would probably be a better word. And so now that some of these things are broken down, like Nathan was just saying, getting to a point where next time this happens, like what if there's an earthquake in a certain area and we don't have access to those PPE in the future? What if negotiations, what if there's a war that breaks out? To what degree are we going to need to respring up some of these, what we thought of as being just one-time emergency services into a more established kind of maker supplied supply chain? And so I would think that one of the most interesting parts of this entire conversation was how somebody like me in like a makerspace gets to talk to these like giant manufacturers that are domestic that never made for the hospital industry, and how we can pull these people together and just get people on the phone from their own homes to make these gigantic deliveries possible, and how hopefully we can keep those masks dropped to that degree for the next emergency. In regards to how gowns got going, like that's a lovely story, just like every other story that came online with the masks all over the country and emergency makers and 3D printing. We just happened to have done ours out of fabric, and it was just because our fabric facility, we were just big enough that we could kind of handle it. I think I was really surprised to see more. Sorry about that. I was surprised to see more, or that there was a lack of gowns production across the country, considering that there was this barrier between desire and perception. Like people are like, I don't want to sew. I'm not into gowns. It's almost like the word itself, gown, lended itself to something that was just not maker-ish. And so even though the production processes are very similar to masks, shields, and the materials needed and the tools needed and the number of people needed, the process and the production line is very similar. There ended up being an extreme drought when it came to gown production, and what a pity that kind of is, and wondering what misstep we might have come under, or the perception that they're not needed, or the perception that it's all sewing. And so we're now at a point working with PPE, Get Us PPE, that we're like, we really need gowns, and everybody's kind of fallen off, like, we don't need shields anymore. I guess we're all set, and we're like, yeah, but we really still need your hands. And so for the next epidemic, or for the next emergency, making sure to just kind of shore up those new emergency services is kind of what I would be interested in, laying down that framework.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Let's go to Karen, if we can. And Karen, I think one of the things I'd love you to talk about is the people side. It's the people making that need to be organized. I know, at least Sarah told me you had 3 shifts running at Artisans Asylum to make the gowns, and you needed volunteers,
Yep,
and then
absolutely.
eventually others to do that.
Yep. Well, in thinking about the question, what did we learn? Something that everyone can learn to do in life is how to ask people for something that you need. And on one part of that is asking people to do something, and another part is asking people to give you something, right? So there's doing and giving. And on the doing side, right, volunteers. We're a largely volunteer-run operation at this point. At last count, we had about 160 volunteers. I would say there's really only about 20 regular people that come in every week. But across that spectrum of 160 or so people, that's a lot of recruitment. Starting out with, how do you find all those people? in the early days, we relied on word of mouth, just members, artisans, um, um, is blessed in that way, that we had a lot of really interested people within the membership that really stepped up and came in and put their hands to good use. But after a while, that started to drop off a little bit, and then we ended up moving our operation to a different location, and so we weren't in the same building. So we kind of had to start all over again and reach out to different community organizations, and you name it, schools or just various organizations that typical of a community. We reached out to everybody that we could think of. So there's that recruitment aspect of it. Then there's working to figure out all the shifts and the scheduling, and taking all the phone calls from people saying, well, can I come in an hour late? And there's all these sort of like personal, putting a person in a slot is and then doing that 8, 3, 20, up to 24 slots a day. It's a lot of people and a lot of conversations, and yeah, anybody who's managed, I'm really just talking about basic volunteer management. So anyone who's managed volunteers will know what I'm talking about. But then just asking them to do some of this work, and maybe again, the people on this panel can appreciate this. It's not, some of the work is really routine. It's fairly straightforward. I hesitate to say boring, but it's very, very rote routine work, and yet you have to ask people to do it. And they have to feel like they're needed and it's important. And you set them up for success. You give them everything that they could, to make them comfortable in that space, doing something, standing on their feet for 3 hours. That's not super interesting. You give them food, you give them music, you give them a really interesting space to work in. We had artists come in and just like plaster the walls with art. You give them stories, and just try and keep people engaged and interested in the project. Was sort of another aspect of it. Yeah, and so that's the volunteer side of things. And just again, getting back to this idea that I was thinking about was like, you have to be good at asking for things. Sarah, I will tell this story over and over and over, how Sarah Miller, back in the early days when there was no fabric to be found, material shortages were just dire. And her and I would drive around in my Subaru, and she would go Home Depot to Home Depot to Home Depot and get them to give us rolls and rolls and rolls of landscaping fabric, because this is, it's the same stuff essentially as, that hospital gowns are made out of. And it was just a matter of asking, telling them what your need was and asking. I could say a lot more. Yeah.
We'll come back. Thank you, Karen. Yeah. Let me go to V Ha from Los Angeles Public Library, runs the makerspace there. Welcome, V.
Karen, this is for you. There's one thing we say, or this is a saying we say in library world: volunteers is not free beer, it's free puppies.
Free puppies?
Volunteers are free puppies because it's so much work. It's not like we're getting free beer, it's free puppies. They got to train the dog.
Yeah, it is like that. I know. I like it though. I've sort of in my element
like free
there.
puppies? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I like free puppies. Yeah, who doesn't?
Yeah. But you have to take that people element and enjoying of working with people.
Oh yeah.
To be able to do that.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to tie what's been said before to the best of my abilities. But I first need to back up and talk about a little bit of what we've been up to. So the Octavia Lab, named after Octavia Butler, based in Los Angeles Public Library. We are a very simple, no frills makerspace. We're open to the public. All you need is a library card and a signed user agreement. We don't train, we don't have any mandatory trainings. You're welcome, come in, join us. So when we were closed, it's kind of like my arm was gone. I didn't know what we could do without the public. And we were then asked to, because we have a public facing email, people were emailing us. We had a doctor who worked in an emergency room, asked us to do it. We then got an email a couple of days later from the mayor's office, Gene Holmes, saying, hey, these are the makerspaces of the city of Los Angeles. Why don't you guys figure something out? So we partnered with a nonprofit called the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator. With them, we prototyped, designed, got approval, partnered with Snap, maker of Snapchat, I mean, all that. Began supplying for hospitals. Because we are a library and because we are named Octavia Butler, we believe in persistence, we believe in habit, we believe in that there's nothing but change. And I made sure that part of our storytelling was that we told the estate what we were up to, and the estate of Octavia Butler is currently financing our PPE production right now. We're currently ramping up to 2,500 a week now. And we've also partnered, this is about civic engagement, about resilience, about making connections. We partnered with Los Angeles County Department of Workforce Development. So we're getting teens jobs, 16, 24-year-olds, we're getting them job development skills, talking about motivation. We were talking about one of the easiest ways to give motivation to teens, we were just talking about this morning, is giving them a say in what we do. And that we're trying to teach them what problem solving looks like, what the maker ethos is. It's about iteration, it's about doing things, it's about working with it. We're also partnered with a hospital registry. I mean, some they were like pretty much found all the problem solvers. This is the world of COVID, where you knock all doors and you ask all the questions. So there is a hospital registry that pretty much reaches out to the 43 COVID hospitals in Los Angeles, where we're working out with them. We're working with Goodwill Industries, trying to get a space to have these teams work in so they can be socially distant. I mean, and on top of that, we're trying to make sure that, we're making a little documentary so that people, our public at the library, public can know what we're up to, so that, in the process of trying to figure out how to get our public involved or getting them the ability to volunteer, we give them instructions on how to make their own face shields. We're, just trying to make sure that the maker ethos and the way of thinking, the way of solving the problem is part and parcel of how we push out this story out to the world. I think I did it.
Okay.
So much of what's been, you guys are talking about is really, and I'm looking at the question that Rachel asked in the chat, is really around sort of a local response. We saw communities were really activating within their local area. And certainly there were things that were done and shipped very, very far distances to other countries to help other folks out. I think, humans across the entire world thought, I can solve this problem. I can help somebody, whether they're close by or far away. But Rachel asked a really, really great question, which is that, a lot of our success or failure in these endeavors has to do with the people that we know and the relationships that, were built. So who knows us? Who do we know? And, as makers, I mean, I think Sarah spoke a little bit to this, there were a lot of people that didn't know us, right? And then all of a sudden they were really desperate. And so maybe they reached out to us, and I don't know, if that, I think that's a good thing in my book, that they reached out to us. But, a lot of it was really dependent on who knew us. Like it was somebody who, you hear the story of Something Labs, for example, and it was like, oh, our roommate happened to be a doctor or, doing this work. And so, she didn't have PPE and she asked us, could you help me with this? You guys are makers. Can you make something for me? And so Rachel asked this really great question of how do we shore up these networks or develop skills for when spaces and networks need to be activated? And I wanted to ask a secondary question to you guys, which is really for us to think, Nation of Makers has been working really hard in collaboration with Make Media and a lot of other groups to really think about the equity question. And I think when you start to talk about relationships, you start to see that we see parity, right? And who knows who and who doesn't know who because of structural inequities and structural racism that's happened over years. So I guess a big question I have is how do we sort of shore up what we've already built? And Sarah alluded to this a little bit, to make sure that we have those longer term relationships with all these partners that we've created. And then how do we build new skills? Because we know that this, unfortunately, is probably not the last pandemic. And it's certainly not, the fires are certainly not the last series of fires. And the floods are not the last series of floods. And, you know, a tornado just went through my neighborhood. So that's not the last tornado and not the last hurricane. And so I think the reality is, you know, we're going to keep seeing these things. So I'll stop talking because I'd love to hear how you guys think that we can sort of work towards that. And I know some of you are working on some efforts to try to do that.
Yeah, so from the open source medical supplies perspective, we've been essentially rebuilding McMaster-Carr for like medical supplies. We actually just released um, a new tool. So we have a combined project library now, whose sole purpose in life is categorizing open source supply designs. So we have 24 design categories that are slowly accumulating projects. So you can kind of go to this thing and navigate through something that actually does look astonishingly like McMaster-Carr when you click projects, because I think it's a super effective tool. But for us, the big thing was like, let's start with the library, like what Nathan was saying. Like, this stuff's been designed before. Like, we don't have to design this every time. Let's start by just figuring out where to put this information so that it stays somewhere and it collects everything that you need to like go out and make stuff later. And it's not the same as like the playbook that we talked about, that we do also have a playbook. If you go to local response and read the guide, we have a playbook for setting up an ad hoc pandemic response, you know, organization essentially. But that's been our kind of effort, is like, okay, let's just be a library. Let's gather all of the information. Let's put it in one place online. And we've been blessed to have really, really, really amazing translation partners throughout all of that, because one of the things that we realized really quickly was that Facebook was this great way to actually hit most of the world and actually let it talk. So we were seeing people use the C translation link to talk to people in other countries. So we'd have like, you know, someone from the Philippines come in and post about gowns as like the first big thing. It's like, here, we've deconstructed gowns, here's the plans, right? And then like a lot of people will click like C translation and be like, whoa, that's crazy, right? And then like somebody in Japan would be like, oh, and here's like a face shield, and somebody else would be like, oh, and here's a mask design. And the fact that we could actually talk across languages was this huge big deal that nobody really thought about. And hey, Facebook is the devil, right, in so many ways. So like, let's not think of it as a tool necessarily, but it turned out to attract everybody. And now we've been doing this thing where we have like a group called Translation Commons and a couple other folks that are now translating probably 250 pages of content that OSMS has generated into something like at least the UNESCO languages, and ideally as many more as possible. And that's happening in the background. So we're like trailing, like there's like hundreds of people trailing us, like spinning out content sideways for their own countries, which is crazy. And if there's one thing that I want to see that gets formalized, it's like, oh, how do we actually get the world talking to each other and sharing these things? Because what we've learned is that, you know, there are engineers everywhere, there are designers everywhere, they all have great ideas, they all come up with really cool stuff that can be made in so many ways. And we need to be able to like capture that information, even if it's not all English, and put it somewhere so that everybody can understand it. So that's like our take, and even that is this like huge monumental task compared to like, oh, how do we have a functional network that stays around forever, that stands up when this crisis, you know, is over and the next one comes, so we don't have to do this again. But yeah, that's our tiny sliver.
Okay. Nathan?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I wanted to jump in on dovetail on that briefly. To try to come back to Dorothy's original question about like how do we bring persistence to the systems that we've stood up in this very ad hoc, running around like chickens with their heads cut off, trying to solve a problem as it's on fire sort of way. I feel like there's a lot of value in what, I imagine some of you here know Danny Beasley from the Oakland Fab City project, who's done a lot of really amazing work, specifically coordinating with local government, city and state government, and demonstrating in real time that a well-organized and coordinated local making and manufacturing community can meet a local need when the supply chain is breaking down, either because of a pandemic or because a hostile president or whatever the fuck is going on. That you can, not only can you make the things that you need when and where you need them, but that there is far more value in that capacity than most people tend to think. The thing that it really comes down to for me, at the sort of the crux of it, is that the global supply chain is possibly the largest system invented by humans, and any system can be optimized for efficiency, or it can be optimized for resilience, but never both. The more you have of one, the less you have of another. And the supply chain that gives us Amazon Prime and just-in-time delivery is 100% optimized for efficiency and 0 for resilience. If we're going to have a supply chain that is at all resilient, we're going to have to create it ourselves, and we're going to have to be a part of it. But we can't just do that on our own. The maker movement is not big enough. It's not all of the pieces of the picture. And you have to coordinate with, not just your neighborhood community, but your city government. You have to coordinate with manufacturing and shipping. And the maker spaces and maker communities I've seen that have reached outside of their kind of comfort bubble to people they don't normally talk to and started forming those relationships are the ones that seem to be the most successful and have the best shot at building something durable.
Okay. Anyone else on this question? Of just sort of, I think of Robert. I'll go to you in just a second. It's also in Chicago where, the great thing about self-organizing networks is they do tap into those relationships that you have and one step away and things like that. But you also miss people. You also don't know everybody. And, there can be real gaps, as there was in Chicago with the African-American community. Nobody was well connected enough until Jackie Moore stepped up and figured that out. So it is a weak link in the strategy that I think, have to figure out how to deal with. Robert?
Yeah, so I unfortunately can't speak to how you build a network, and I admire the people who know how to do that. But one of the things that I would like to see is for every maker or every person who's at all interested in this, be easy for them to slot in and use their talents in some way. So when we're not in the middle of a crisis, the question becomes, well, how do we motivate people to do a similar kind of work? And it seems to me it requires a certain amount of leadership in terms of project definition and problem definition. But as Nathan said, it's also the case that we live in a world of global poverty. There are, if we move outside of the United States or inside the United States to underserved communities, you can find people who maybe need medical supplies that we might not have thought of before this. And if you can tell the human story of connecting that need to the average maker, it may be possible to say to a large community of makers, there's a place for you to use your talents, whether that is sewing or soldering, as I'm doing right now, or more sophisticated engineering in expectation of some greater need. In that way, we have to engineer the motivation of people to stay interested in these issues. But I think we now have at least a few mechanisms for doing that.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I just want to mention is we were talking about, several of you mentioned about the sort of collaboration side of this, and Lars, who's with Artisans Asylum, really, I thought gave me a really interesting picture that the change that Artisans Asylum had to go through was, instead of just being a place where people came to do their own work, it came to be a place where you had to decide what work was going to get done and who was going to do it and how to, really have intention behind this. And I think I hope that is something that makerspaces could I guess learn from and build upon. It's like other nonprofits and things. They have a mission, and their job is to, fulfill that mission. And organizing around, say, public service or other kind of public innovation would be a really great model there. Robert, could you talk a little bit about this, what you see as kind of a need for an organization dealing with open source hardware or open source medical hardware?
Yeah. So one of the hard things that we learned as the pandemic moved from, at least in the United States, moved from people are going to die because we don't have an equipment to a somewhat steadier thing is the need for an organization to manage FDA approval and liability issues and financing issues. And so I specialize in ventilators, which are very sophisticated, life-critical machines that bring with them a lot of liability if they're going to be deployed outside of an emergency situation. And so I think we need to set up structures which combine philanthropists who are willing to fund the development of sophisticated devices and go through the FDA approval process so that it's not just a design. I love open source designs. Those are the beginning of this process. But you also have to have a planned manufacturing process and regulatory approval, because the FDA doesn't approve designs. They approve manufacturers who have designs in their hand to accomplish things. And so I think what we can do is stand up one or more firms, and from my point of view, they would be nonprofit firms, but they could be for-profit firms as well, who are prepared to build, to manufacture the spectrum of simple medical devices all the way up to very sophisticated medical devices in advance of that need. And because it's very hard to get someone to pay for something in advance of that need, I think we have to go to philanthropists to sort of give us money to do that, because I think the COVID-19 situation has shown people that a little bit of preparation can have a huge societal benefit. It's expensive, but it's relatively inexpensive to design a ventilator and be ready to manufacture it compared to manufacturing 10,000 of them. That's a much, you don't have to manufacture 10,000 of them and stockpile them where they'll eventually become useless anyway, if you can prepare for this. Of course, the problem is no one individual has a great interest in doing all the work necessary to accomplish that. So I think as a community which is now more aware of the social impact of our communal behavior, perhaps we could stand up nonprofits, not unlike open source medical supplies or helpful engineering, although as far as I know, neither of them are actually seeking FDA approval or actually going that far in preparation of these kinds of things.
Okay, thank you.
I do want to tag on to that real quick, which is just to say, I think one of the big things that we've learned is that the policy level is really important, right? A lot of what has allowed a lot of this to happen is the FDA's emergency use authorizations, and moving faster than I've seen the FDA ever move in its entire history of anything. And that's been true from everything from PPE to, more complex supplies and, inventing this EUA process. And one of the thoughts that we've been having is how do we as a group of makers, as the folks who have been responding, help pitch to formalize this possibly just for disasters, but this kind of like policy around making things that are simple in broad communally supportive ways, in ways that aren't harmful, right? Like we've done a really good job of self-regulating, but it would be great if there was a formal process where it's like, oh, there's another pandemic, the FDA understands, let's pull this trigger, right? And like, set up this EUA system again and get ready and release, all of these things. And like if the CDC had open source plan for cloth masks at the start, they could have said, hey, make your own masks out of a t-shirt right now.
Right.
Here's how you do it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think I would think it'd be interesting if a group like yours could do some policy recommendations to the government, of some type. That would be really helpful, because I don't think most of us feel like we have anybody listening, or even understanding what's going on here. So I think that would be a big step forward for us. Let me get Karen to come back on, and not necessarily with a question, but just, I'd like to continue talking about the sort of the volunteers and the asking part is, you're a different kind of organization when you have to go out and ask for things, right? I'm thinking a little bit, Guy, you had a bunch of people show up asking how I can help, and you had to organize them. So that's one side of this, but also finding those people and then organizing them so that they're really helpful. Before I go, let's just, I'm out in California, and we just had the fires up here, 2 weeks ago or a week ago. And two things happen. One, in the institutional response, like the people in charge of fighting the fires are saying, evacuate, get away from your homes. And then the next day coming out and saying, well, we don't have enough firefighters to protect the areas that are out there. And so people are saying, well, what can I do? And there isn't this connection often to say, well, how could we use more resources? California's even more complex because they used to have inmate firefighters participating in the fire, and then they let them go because of COVID-19, but they didn't bring them back on. And there's some licensing and other issues that have to do with that. But there was not, we have volunteer fire departments and stuff still in California, but there wasn't a sense of how do you scale to tackle problems that are much larger than what we're used to tackling. So that's why I kind of want to come back to you, Karen, is just sort of that mechanism that you're working on is really important.
Well, what you reminded me of is how often I had to go backwards in the pipe to the project leads to say, do you have the materials? Do you have the space? Do you have, the equipment? Is the equipment running properly? Do you have the supplies? And all of those things had to be in place. And if one of them fell off the map, I had to cancel the volunteer shift. It drove me nuts, honestly. And it wasn't anyone's particular fault. It was just like, moving backwards through the pipe to make sure that everything was again, like setting people up for success so that I could plan in advance to put the right number of shifts on at the right times to get the most throughput as possible. So that's one aspect of it is finding yourself sort of in the center of those two worlds, the people who are saying, what can I do? And then the people who are responsible for making the jobs, for making sure that the work is there to do and breaking it down into its component parts that just that people are able to help. There were also just a lot of people who said, well, I only want to work at my house. Sarah, you experienced that. She would get phone call after phone call saying, well, I really want to help, but I don't want to come in. And I know, look at Sarah's face. It was, we basically had to say, we're really sorry, but there's only so much. If we had a person within the makerspace step up to take over a cloth masks initiatives for home sewers. So that was great. There was at least one offering that we could give to people to say, this is what you could do. We'll collect the masks at the space and, distribute them to volunteers and anybody else who needs them. What else can what other questions can I answer?
I have a question.
I'm at a loss. Yeah.
So, sometimes in movies and comic books, you have like Avengers Assemble or, form of Buckaroo Banzai Blue Blazer Strike Team, right?
Yeah.
It sounds like you were doing that in this one moment of crisis, right? It seems to me if we could get that energy to persist, to be able to say to people, makers assemble, right? Even if what we're doing is not necessarily a crisis, right? It's just the mission today is to build masks and send them to Guatemala, right?
Right.
It seems like we would develop the organizational skill set in addition to the making skills that would persist and serve us well for the next crisis.
Mm-hmm. And I think, you're absolutely right. And I think V put into the chat a few groups that have been doing this really well and sort of engaging in different ways. And I think the Aunties, I don't know, V, if you want to share who the Aunties are. I think a lot of people on the call know who.
I would love to know. I don't know who they are. I love the name.
Okay. So, tell us about the Aunties and what they're doing. But I think it's a great example of sort of, volunteerism and a bunch of people that may not have come together otherwise, right? In an interesting way.
Dorothy, you might be able to. I can talk about our involvement with the Aunties, but I don't know if I can do the genesis story.
How about you start, and then I'll try to fill in.
Once upon a time. Okay. So there's this comedian of some person. Okay, so it's a volunteer group, and people who are very much beginning sewers, learning to sew, and they were going to make masks. And they're only going to do one thing. They're going to do one thing well, and they were going to make masks. And they ship them out to communities of need, such as Navajo Nation. We got in touch with them through Dorothy because they wanted to find a laser cutter. And I thought I could make a better connection. We're going to hook you up with the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, which can get you a die cutter. So it was kind of like, how can I, it's more of like, how can I make this go faster, and how brave these women or these humans are, humans are who are teaching themselves to sew from home. I mean, it's like all their fingers are still there from what I've heard.
Yeah. And I think the great thing about that particular story is that it's a group of people, again, who, I like to, harp a little bit on the, we spent the good part of the last decade, and when I say we, it's mostly Dale, and a lot of us also supporting the efforts to talk about everyone being a maker, right? And what does that look like? And I think going back to sort of that theme and really, how do we engage humans all around the earth, right? To take that maker spirit that we know that we all have, to engage it and to use it to solve problems that are not somewhere really, really far away, but right in our backyard, right? And how do we create, what we're asking tonight is like, how do we create these resilient communities, not only just to fight the issues that are, like pandemics and really, really large issues, but even as Robert's saying, there have been problems in your communities all along, right? And sometimes we don't see them because we're not engaging the right people, or we're not talking to the right people, or we're not listening to the right people. And I think one thing that's really beautiful about the Aunties is that they kind of came together again as this group of people that were just like, I want to help in some way. They don't produce a terribly great large volume as singular individuals, but collectively they've given thousands and thousands of masks away to different, communities, and have really helped. And they had a specific focus on marginalized communities and communities that weren't getting PPE, maybe even in some of the best efforts to try to, to diversify. I know we're bringing in Rachel, and Rachel actually has been doing a lot of work and also reaching different communities, and had some really amazing resources to share from Ace Makerspace, which is already doing such great work around equity and around making sure that the relationships that were being curated in Oakland were really, really intentional. And Rachel's been on the show too before, so she's an
Hi, Rachel.
I'd
Unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Will you ask your question that you just put in the chat?
Yeah, I'd be happy to ask my question that I put in the chat. When it comes to fostering resiliency, how can we create a culture in our spaces of mutual interest as opposed to the more traditional American self-interest? I'm going to be successful by working hard and pulling myself up from my bootstraps, which is admirable, but it's not necessarily community oriented, and it doesn't foster an ongoing practice. So I'm highly interested on how we can create playbooks or methodologies where we have that, so the emergency isn't down the street factor. We make it for Guatemala or for wherever, so that it's a dance we know how to dance in our communities, and it isn't like the oh shit pandemic reaction only.
Good question.
I think one of the things that we did in the very, very early days of Artisans Asylum, because we were dirt poor and had no money and had a lot of shop to equip, is we actually made building out the space part of our classes, and actually made like group projects part of our classes. So, the wood shop didn't have any tables, so we're going to hold a wood shop class for training you how to use the wood shop by building wood shop tables. Right? So like everybody, like you don't pay as much for the class as you would for a normal fee, right? Because what you're paying for is like building our infrastructure for us, right? And the teachers volunteer their time. It was literally called Building the Asylum, where like you'd have metalworking, woodworking, all of these other crafts that would train people in how to use the tools, which is kind of the function of the makerspace. But you would build community and you would build skills by doing things for the community. And I could easily imagine it's like, oh, you want to learn how to use a laser cutter. We're to learn the laser cutter by making face shields for, the shelter down the street, right? Or we're going to learn how to sew by making cloth masks for blah, right? And just like in my mind, it's just, you need excuses for community building anyway in a makerspace, right? You need like the thing you all come together to do. And you can have competitions, you can have group projects, like all of this stuff.
That's a really good idea. I've been thinking lately of the idea of being like makerspace being like a clinic, where people come in with problems, right? And you decide which ones to work on, like an innovation clinic or community clinic. But I think that's some good thoughts. Robert, you were going to jump in on this, I think.
Yeah, well, I feel a little silly saying this, but to me, it really works. I mean, one of the things you have to do is recognize people. It's like we need to have lots and lots of gold stars that we hand out to people. And handing out gold stars to people is more valuable when it's for the right thing. When you recognize people for what they really contributed, it's far more valuable than if you don't, So, for example, Engineers Without Borders, I don't think they do a very good job doing this, but they do have projects all over the world. If someone makes masks for people in Guatemala, we need to give them a gold star that says, you made 100 masks for people in Guatemala. You may have saved 1.5 lives by doing that, And I think there's an enormous amount of untapped energy that we could harness if we were better at recognizing the contribution that people make. And instead of saying, well, you learned this skill and you're a better maker, say, no, we recognize you because you made a material impact on the lives of people who aren't in your own neighborhood.
Yeah.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah, sure. Go on, Nathan.
One other great story that kind of along these lines that I use when I'm trying to build the feedback mechanisms to offer gold stars. And there is a lot to be said for the sort of the artisanal approach. But there's a really great story out of Norway where they used a very simple feedback mechanism to drive this sort of community-oriented thinking kind of through the roof. And basically what it was is they had a dearth of blood in their blood banks. They could not get enough people to come in and donate blood. And they just did one thing and suddenly had to be turning people away. All they did was they put a QR code on each bag of blood, and every time it was taken out of the freezer and given to somebody, they scanned it and it auto-generated a text message to the person who donated it saying, you know, someone is using your blood right now, you've helped someone. And instantly everyone was like lining up to go do it. Just the feedback mechanisms even can be incredibly simple and in many cases easy to automate.
Yeah. That's great. Feedback is a
I'm
terribly
like,
important
now
thing.
my brain is thinking, can we do, like, we need to do this. We need to do this for all the PPE. We can do this, right? Like, we just QR code everything, right, Key? We could totally do that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what the videos were, right? Is like all of the like maker overview type videos.
But I'm like thinking about Sarah's labeling, and I'm like, Sarah, we could put like the gowns, right? We could do QR codes for the gowns, right? Like that's what we're doing. We're on it. We're on it.
It's
I
great.
love
We're
that.
doing it.
I think that's incredible.
Well, we've reached an hour. I do want to say just in thinking further along Rachel's question, because I think, Rachel, we were talking about that a little bit earlier of really almost rethinking makerspaces around that kind of goal. There are examples of mutual aid societies. There's a history of them. I haven't have any much luck exploring that or figuring that out. If anybody knows more about that, I think it'd be a great topic for future. How could we see makerspaces as mutual aid societies and what we could learn from them? And often they were, from what I've seen, they've been, fostered in minority communities and other things as ways of helping each other get through things. So, Rachel, did you want to?
To that end, I invite anybody to the conversation, or we can have another discussion. But ACE is actually experimenting in that right now. And part of our experiment as we re-envision ourselves as a space is doing a relationship mapping exercise and literally proactively going out and making relationships and fostering relationships with other social good organizations in the East Bay. And it is something that we learned in the crucible that was rapid response, but we're watching it propagate out in ways beyond pandemic response. And by no means have we nailed it, but we're having amazing experiences creating relationships we never considered before. Yeah. So
and that's great. I'd love to follow up on that. Maybe we could do something together on that. Nathan, I just want to follow up on the, just the supply chain stuff. Another area that I would love to see us dive into more. I recall, maybe in April or so, people were saying they could not buy elastic. And I thought, how could we be out of elastic? They were doing what Sarah was doing, is going to Home Depots and they go, no, we're out. There was a window when they got it, but it's sort of back to the policy things. We don't think about running out of elastic, where is it made? We just think of these things as being endlessly available, and it's kind of your Amazon example. Yes, I can order and get it tomorrow, so why should I worry about where it comes from? So anyway, lots to follow up on. Lastly, I just want to thank everybody that was working on the notes document. This is the first time we've done it, and I don't know who Anonymous Chipmunk is, but thank you very much. For writing a lot here and other people, but it really is a great view of this to get lots of this down, the conversation, the questions, and it suggests that there's a lot more to talk about. So again, I'm really happy to see that experiment work here. So thank you all. We haven't solved anything by talking, but necessarily, but sharing ideas and learning from each other is a great thing. And thank you for the work you're doing. And please, you have my gold star. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much for being here. And I think, we're all kind of working on our little pieces of things. And one thing I will say is, like, to encourage everyone to continue to be in conversation with one another. So, you know, if you're interested in what Rachel's doing, please do get engaged with what she's doing. If you're interested in OSMS, you know, please get engaged with what they're doing with public invention, with helpful engineering, with the Octavia Butler Makerspace, you know, with Artisans Asylum. Make sure that you're engaged with Nation of Makers and make community. But we really just need to share, right? We are the community. And I think as we come up with solutions to the meta issues of how do we, you know, persist and are resilient, we need to share them with one another and use those ideas and, you know, keep iterating to improve upon them. Because one thing we realize is that we are better together. And we're more resilient as a community than we are as individuals. So I just wanted to sort of say that and, you know, have you guys, you know, think about it. And I'm always happy to work with all of you guys and so excited that I get to in so many ways.
Okay.
And I know Dale is likewise.
Great. Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. It was
Take
fun.
care. Good night.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you so much.